And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Jan Henry from the University of Loughborough in the UK. And Jan is also the director of the Olympic Study Centre in the UK. Not exactly sure about the name, but you will tell us. And has been involved in many duties or many programs. Also the MEMOS program. We are together in the MEMOS program, which is a master's program. There's a master's program in Olympia, but there's a master program going on for 20 years this year. Since 1995, we are very proud of it. And it has been followed by many National Olympic Committees, staff members, or even presidents and secretary generals, and so on. Yes. Please.
The MEMOS program is a great learning environment for us as members of staff, I think, as well. I'm going to be talking in this presentation about methodological aspects, but I just wanted to say something which I'll come back to at the end, which was a response to Josephine Clausen's question to Otto Schanzer about British horse racing. So if I've got time at the end, and this will make me be disciplined, I just would, and you humour me, I'll just 1 minute for a story about doping and British horses. But I'm not really going to be talking about the legacy of the London Games. I'm going to be dealing with the technocratic aspects of some of the methodological elements to assessing the impact of the Games, more specifically to considering the benefits of the meta-evaluation approach which was adopted. And the structure of what I want to say is this. I'm going to say something a little bit about London Games and legacy promises and how those were codified for the purposes of the meta-evaluation study. I'm going to say something about meta-evaluation as an approach to assessment of legacy, and then focus on meta-synthesis, which is the crucial element of meta-evaluation, and specifically looking at how meta-synthesis of results of studies of evaluations of projects and so on and so forth can tell us something about whether or not the Games leads to higher levels of sports participation. The fourth thing I'm going to say is I want to look at realist evaluation and how this can move forward some of the rewards of evaluation studies in terms of understanding what causes the outcomes that we're seeking. And then I'll finally finish with some concluding remarks. But if I take the context of the London Games and the legacy promises, the government was quite bold, I think. It was the Labour government when it commissioned a 3-year independent meta-evaluation study from a team led by Grant Thornton, and our centre was fortunate to be part of that team. And that team was commissioned to do 5 reports, and the 5th one just came out last year. And the format of the reports was based around 4 core areas of legacy. Harnessing the UK's passion for sport, which was both about promoting elite sport and about promoting participation, exploiting opportunities for economic growth, promoting community engagement and regeneration of East London. And my remarks today are going to be around sport, and specifically around the thorny question of how we demonstrate, or whether we can demonstrate, that hosting the Games can be a stimulus to increased sport participation within the wider population of the host community, the host nation. I'll say something briefly about meta-evaluation as an approach to assessing legacy. The way the project was conceived by government was, I think, quite daring, in the sense that they both encouraged the use of this new technique in a new area to test whether or not the Games delivered what the government had promised it would deliver. But also they sought to test the methodology itself, so that public research money was used for a methodological evaluation of the study and the process and so on and so forth. And the group that was responsible for developing the methods paper claimed in their report to the DCMS that the study was of the utmost importance, and claimed it was, in fact, the single largest and most comprehensive evaluation exercise ever commissioned in connection with the event. I haven't seen the evidence for that, but I don't know of another meta-evaluation study of major public events, and certainly not of major sporting events, nor of the Olympics. So it was a big deal, and it was supposed to be a big deal. But let me say something, for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with meta-evaluation as an approach, about the approach itself. The term meta-evaluation dates back to the 1960s, late 1960s, and its application has evolved really into two principal dimensions of activity. The first one is evaluation synthesis, combining the power of individual evaluations to draw more robust evidence-supported conclusions. And the second is evaluation of evaluations, assessing the quality of the methods adopted and the confidence that you might place in the findings of these studies. And synthesis takes one of two principal forms. This one, meta-analysis, we can probably not worry too much about, because meta-analysis focuses on the combining of findings of independent studies which have employed statistical analysis of the effectiveness of particular interventions, and builds up by combining studies together into a meta-sample, large-scale samples where meta-analysis seeks to provide a more precise estimate of treatment effects and so on. And it's used in medical research largely with randomized controlled trials and so on and so forth. So in terms of our evaluations, we're not talking about randomized controlled trials, and I think you can put this to one side. But more significant is the metasynthesis approach. And here we're using qualitative and quantitative evaluations of the impact of a particular phenomenon or intervention, and from these analyses, conclusions are drawn through the pooling of evidence across studies of different types, but with applying common standards of rigor. Maybe different methods, but the standards of rigor are supposed to be the common aim. And the approach aims to develop evidence-based understanding of policy outcomes, accumulating, reviewing, and aggregating knowledge together in a highly specific field. And of course, the field that we're talking about is in the area of generation of additional physical activity and participation in sport. The evaluation of evaluations focuses not on outcomes, but on the evaluation process, establishing the rigor with which the evaluations have been undertaken, and thus a means of establishing whether particular studies should be included in any meta-synthesis or indeed in any meta-analysis. So that's what we're trying to do, when we gathered together a whole range of studies. Government had heavily funded this project and leaned on every organisation in the sort of Olympic domain and the sporting domain to give us their data about projects that they'd use to leverage additional participation. And apart from LOCOG itself, which was very coy about giving us data and said that they were an independent company and not beholden to government, most organisations concurred and were happy indeed to give data to be included in the analysis. So, metasynthesis, this is the core of the meta-evaluation project. Metasynthesis, in this case, if we restrict ourselves to considering active participation and enhancement of the numbers of people involved in sport, metasynthesis involved two types of source. There were national survey data at the top down, giving us a picture of the overall participation levels by the population over time. And we're fortunate in the UK in having had two participation surveys ongoing at the time of the games. The first is the Active People Survey, which is commissioned by Sport England. And that uses landline telephone surveys with a very large sample, 161,000 households. There's some issues or problems with the methodology employed by restricting themselves to landline telephones, for example. It's an unduly older population, and unrepresentatively older population, because younger households quite often will be dependent solely on their mobiles. But taking part involves face-to-face interviews with almost 10,000 adults and with 801 children between the ages of 11 and 15. So these are large samples, and although there are some reservations about the methods employed for collecting the data, and indeed the care with which the data is collected, my colleague Paul Downward, who worked on the national survey data as part of this, kept uncovering misallocations in coding and so on and so forth. So he said that some of the data, there was a very large survey, but some of the data was quite ropey, and he was able to demonstrate that as well. The third area is the physical education and sport strategy for young people, the PESIP set of initiatives, which included a school-based review of the amount of participation in high-quality sport and physical education young people were involved in. And the target was 2 hours initially, and as the target was achieved for 90% of the population, the school population, it was increased to 3 hours, but more of that in a moment. I'm not going to be dealing a lot with data because I want to focus on principles rather than data. But here's, is there a, yes there is a, yeah. Here's a typical piece of evidence from the Active People survey data. It looks at, these are in millions, these are the 14 million, 14.1 million of the population at the start of the survey in 2005 to 2006 were taking part in at least one 30-minute bout of active, either physical activity or sport. And the idea was to grow that, but if you look at all the efforts that were made in the run-up to the games, there was a panic here by government. They began to think, actually, we're not making any difference at all. Fortunately, there was a statistically significant leap in 2012 itself, and of course, government breathed a heavy sigh of relief, and Sport England put out these figures and so on and so forth, and then immediately after the games it started to come down again. So yes, there was a spiking for the games, and the data nationally will tell us that, but whether that's going to be sustained is another matter. But I want to focus on what we were doing before we got to the games and before we got the good news, which turned out maybe to be a false dawn, we don't really know. Because at this level, we were getting from both Active People and from the Taking Part survey the message that this was a flat line. If this was a heart patient, get the electric things and slam them on the chest because the patient's not responding. And but while we were trying to synthesize this data from the national surveys with the data from the local surveys were telling us we're making a major inroad into increasing levels of participation. And we were trying in the process of this synthesis to try to understand why the two sets of data should be pointing in different directions. And I'll come to that. The kind of data that we had for the bottom-up stuff, the individual projects and programs and so on, related to 20 projects. And I name some of them here. Sportivate and Gold Challenge, for example, were part of a Sport England there were 2 projects as part of a Sport England project. The school games, which was a competitive system of inter-school sport and intra-school sport as well, introduced by the new government, but replacing the old PESIP system, the old physical education and sports strategy that I've already referred to. And things like the Change for Life sports clubs, which introduced over 61,000 young people participating, and the claim is that 90% of those participating in sport, in a new opportunity for sport, were continuing to do that as at the end of the first year of exposure to the Change for Life Sport Club initiative. 2 things were discontinued, and again I'll come back to those. PESIP, the sports strategy, the school sports strategy, school sport partnerships, which underpinned this, was a key feature of Labour's policy, and that was replaced by the school games. And whether or not we can count, therefore, the school games as an increase in participation, or whether it's just replacing this participation, is a key issue. So, in terms of looking at the quality of the evidence and of the evaluations, the national surveys providing data, some difficulties of measurement, some criticism in terms of the nature of the sample and so on, but on the whole, data that people were willing to trust, particularly in 2012 when it gave good news. But the major difficulties were of measurement at the individual programme and project level. The first issue that we highlighted in reviewing the quality of the evaluations was the quality of the data. And if I take the physical education and sports strategy as a key example, in a number of cases, or, well, in fact in the majority of cases, we were reliant for data from these individual projects. We were reliant on people who were actually delivering the projects to record the data and report. But they were reporting, of course, on their own performance. And so it was in their interests to boost the numbers. And in terms of the physical education and school sports strategies, the definition of what counts as high quality physical education was left to those who were filling in the questionnaire. There was no objective definition. And typically, school staff filled in the questionnaire. Normally, it was the head of physical education who's having their service reviewed, or it could be the head teacher who's worried about having their school reviewed and so on. So the data's can be pretty shaky. And actually, we've got an independent survey which wasn't asking exactly the same questions from Ipsos Mori at one point in time in 2008. And we can see that the independent survey more or less gives, with more or less the same type of question, gives a much lower level of participation in sport on on the part of school children. So the quality of the data becomes a real problem. The partial evaluations or the non-availability of evaluations was, again, another point. Everybody, apart from LOCOG, promised to give us the evaluations. Some of them never got round to it. The project ended. There were loss of key staff and so on and so forth, and the evaluations weren't undertaken. Some actually had never planned to do an evaluation. They just planned to record the numbers that were attending their project and to report that as data. So in addition to the notion of challenging the validity of what constitutes high quality physical education or the reliability of the calculation of staff, we've got projects that aren't actually evaluating at all. So some are evaluating badly, some are evaluating partially, and some are not evaluating at all. And there's a kind of absence of external audit or verification of the robustness of the data collection. But the most regular issue and the most significant limitation, I think, was the failure to address issues of additionality. Additionality as a concept relates to assessing what the overall impact of a project is by assessing the outcome of that intervention or that project. So you get the gross impact figure if you just get the people attending, the numbers attending, for example. To get the net impact, you have to take away outcomes that would have happened anyway, people who would have been attending anyway, and establish some kind of net impact figure. And in order to do that, we have to take into account aspects of leakage, where the program is providing for individuals who weren't the intended target of the program. Displacement, where a new project is provided, but an old project is stopped, is displaced from the system because of the new project's availability. Substitution, where an individual says, I'll go to this new project and I'll substitute it for what I'm doing in terms of physical exercise elsewhere. And in a positive vein, the multiplier effect, where providing opportunities for, say, one member of the family encourages another member of the family also to participate, like, for example, when a parent takes a child swimming and gets into the pool themselves and so on. So if we want to, this is classic stuff for evaluation, if we want to be able to identify the net impact rather than the gross impact, then we need to be able to assess these things. Well, almost all of the studies, the evaluation studies that we were given, didn't consider additionality, or didn't fully consider additionality. They might have considered some aspects, but not others. And I've just put a couple of examples here. One which is the School Games Initiative, which replaced the School Sports Partnerships, which was part of the old PESIP, Physical Education and Sport Strategy for Young People. And the School Games Initiative's evaluation was an evaluation as if School Sports Partnerships, which it replaced, had never existed at all. So every child that participated in the school games was treated as a new participant. And of course, that gives a ludicrously positive picture of participation. Sportivate, which was a big project, provided 100,000 opportunities for sport for young people through introductory coaching sessions and then trying to introduce them to clubs. But they didn't consider whether the new participants displaced others in clubs, because of course clubs have coaching equipment and space resources that are finite, and there's a finite carrying capacity and so on. So those questions simply weren't addressed. And these examples, I could have used many of the other schemes that we've got. The only really good example of calculating additionality was a study by PricewaterhouseCoopers on a free swimming scheme, which was for the population under 16 and over 60, so to get the young and the old swimming. And in fact, ironically, because they calculated additionality, and because it showed that, and in fact, in additionality terms, the additional swimming was probably not worth the money. Government stopped the scheme in just after its first year. And the problems they identified were substitution. Swimmers were reducing their attendance at other sessions in order to attend these free sessions. Displacement. Adults were being displaced from pools because young kids were getting in free, and you know, if you've been lane swimming or whatever, the thing that you most look forward to is being mown down by a 14-year-old who's swimming twice as fast as you and doesn't care whether you're in the way or not. And leakage, in the sense that the people who were attracted to the free scheme were actually not the target for the project. They were individuals who were already swimming and exercising above the norm, and as a consequence, the aim of the free swimming scheme to raise levels of activity amongst the older population and the younger population that were not participating, that aim was not being met. So where good evaluation practice was undertaken, it was used as a rationale by government to stop the funding. So, c'est la vie. But I want to finish now by referring to realist evaluations and the value of causal attribution in the achievement of policy outcomes. What do I mean by that? Well, the traditional examples, examples of evaluations that we've talked about already, they uncover, they report, they might report net impact if they've done their, if they've looked at the additionality issues and so on and so forth. But what they don't do is they don't directly address causal mechanisms. They don't tell you what brings about that successful or that unsuccessful or partly successful outcome. It's partly because that's not the way that the question is addressed. And I was asking Caroline after her presentation about the way that the studies that she was looking at were addressing the issue. And the studies are really largely about what works. I want to know what works. But realist evaluation says that's an inappropriate question. What you really need to ask is what works for who, under what circumstances, and with what kinds of outcomes. And with this in mind, we undertook a micro-study, which is published, but only in electronic form now. I think the paper version comes out later in the year. We undertook a local evaluation of the Workplace Challenge program. And Workplace Challenge is a free online competition between local businesses, local employing organisations, and it ran in 2 years, 2011 and 2012. And what participants do is they log their level of exercise, not just in whether or not they cycle to work, for example, in whether or not they, how much walking they did during the day, or whatever. And the aim was to stimulate competition between organisations in terms of the recorded levels of sport and exercise. You know, which organisation could have the healthiest workforce. And prizes were offered as incentives to encourage both the organisation. I think there was a £2,000 prize for the top organisation and a bicycle for the top individual in individual organisations in terms of their participation data. I mean, a proper bike, not like mine. This is either a road bike or a racing bike or a mountain bike. I can't remember which. To facilitate the activities of the organisations that were involved in delivering this, they were given toolkits, resources, and support centrally as well in terms of ideas, etc. So that they would actively engage with the programme. And then we evaluated the 2 waves of activity in 2011 and 2012 with two waves of a questionnaire and with a certain number of qualitative data from interviews with participants and programme deliverers. So it's a micro-study. Okay, so this is just the crude data, and I put the crude data up to show what this doesn't tell us as much as what it does. But the key thing which it does tell us is that those participating in this 1 times 30 minutes exercise for 6 days or 7 days per week increases from 16% before the workplace challenge to 49% after the workplace challenge. So 10%, 39%, 49% in total. I mean, that's a huge increase. Now there are some issues again with the data, but I'll come back to that when we deal with this in the article anyway. But as Ray Pawson, who's the guru in terms of realist evaluation, and other proponents of this approach point out, the question's not about what works, but rather what works for whom? Men, women, age groups, whether it's people with previous expertise or exercise history. How does it work? In what ways? Is it in terms of sport, or is it in terms of non-sport but exercise? Is it competitive? Is it recreational? Is it episodic? Is it regular? Under what kinds of circumstances? In which kinds of contexts? Which kinds of organisations are exercise friendly? One of the issues that we identified as important was the existence of organisational champions within the organisation that encouraged people to participate and stick to their engagement with the workplace challenge. And the nature of the work within the organisation, was it physical or was it sedentary? Or the nature of the work of the individual as well as the organisation. And then what were the kinds of outcomes? The types, the regularity, the sustainability of the activity itself. But at the core of the realist analysis is the identification of things which actually make a difference to change. And there were intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, the extrinsic motivator being the prize and so on, the intrinsic motivator being, get yourself healthier, fitter, and so on and so forth. In terms of barriers to participation, there were organisations with positive organisational cultures in respect of exercise, and those with neutral or negative cultures as well. So our issue with workplace challenge wasn't necessarily in answering the question, does it work or not? It's who does it work for, and in what circumstances, and why. And when we looked at our data, and I'm using here a model which is much used by Ray Pawson, and it's almost a cliche now. We looked at the context. The context was the staging of the games nationally, and our expectation was that the staging of the games nationally would provide focus for people to really centre on physical activity and its impacts, and that the effective impact of the games would be positive, and it would generate interest in sport and lifestyles, and we were able in our questionnaire to tease out whether these were true, and to what extent and for whom. The actions that were taken, the Leicestershire Strategy Group that provided the framework for the Workplace Challenge also promoted information on the benefits of sport and exercise in target organisations, and so provided not just the framework to engage with the thing, but also the information about the benefits of exercise, which would hopefully motivate people to participate. The causal mechanisms were interesting. People were motivated by competition. That was a key part of the scheme. Not all people, some subgroups were not motivated by competition. They wanted to have their own record of their own exercise, but they were competing against themselves. They wanted to exercise more than they did the week before, and so on and so forth. But for certain types of individual, internal competition in the organisation and competition with other organisations was an important motivator. And creating a public record of physical activity. When you put on the website how much activity you'd done, that was there. That was public record. You weren't necessarily named, but your contribution to the organisation's overall exercise record for the week or the month was public view. And because it was made public, because you weren't the only one who knew, then you didn't let yourself off, because you look at other people's results, and if everybody else is exercising more this week than they did last week, and so on and so forth, there's a certain element of guilt about not doing. So the mechanisms were interesting as they emerged. And then the outcomes, increased physical activity by only some individuals, some types of individual, and in certain types of context certainly took place. And the assumption that it leads to health and thus to productivity and economic gains from reduced health costs was something that we didn't test, but we did test whether or not the organisations participating anticipated this, and this was something which they claimed they anticipated would be an outcome. And something which we hadn't anticipated was increased social interaction, enhancing social capital. I mean, a typical comment which I can remember from qualitative feedback on a questionnaire was that since we've been involved in the programme, I've talked to more people in other departments in my organisation than I ever have done before, because I happen to know that they're in the workplace challenge as well. So the store of social capital of the individual was also benefiting, if you like, from the overall process. So that's my presentation. I tried to make it 20 minutes because I thought we were 20 minutes and 10 minutes for questions. But the key points are a full synthesis of evaluations is only worth the paper it's written on if you've got certain quality thresholds that are respected in terms of the evaluations included in the synthesis. And one thing I think we should have done with the 20 studies that we did, we evaluated them all individually, but we should have had a template. For example, with the additionality things, do they take into account substitution? Do they take into account displacement, leakage, and so on and so forth? And that would have been a neat snapshot would have been a good slide actually to show how weak some of those evaluations were, and with problems of the quality of the data and so on and so forth that we talked about earlier. Again, these are issues that need to be addressed if we want to improve our evaluation system. And apart from our own study, we found that all of the other studies where they were strong was in identifying data on outcomes, but not on addressing causes of these outcomes. And identifying whether certain outcomes occur without actually explaining what causes these outcomes to be brought about is really of limited value to policymakers. There's a need, I think, for detailed realist evaluations which will identify causal explanations and test them and provide context-specific explanations of causality. I think better understanding of the causes of change can directly inform policy decision-making for the future, even if those causes of change are context-specific. So that's everything I had to say about that. If I could come back, have I earned the right to? Yeah. Okay. This is a one minute, and it's in relation to in relation to Josephine's question about improved British horse performance over the century. And it reminded me of a story about the Duke of Norfolk, who was a great patron of cricket, and he was an owner of racehorses as well, but he was managing the England cricket team in Australia, and they had a day off when they weren't actually playing cricket, so he went to the race track because one of his horses was running. And he got there, and the trainer was talking with the jockey and talking with the horse as well, I suppose. But and just as he arrived, the trainer gave the horse a sugar lump. And ever conscious of the doping regulations, the Duke of Norfolk said to him, I hope that sugar lump hasn't got anything funny in it. And the trainer said, no, Your Grace, it's perfectly okay. Look, I'll have one, you have one. So the Duke of Norfolk, to one and so on. And the Duke of Norfolk went back to the stands to go and watch the race, and the trainer got on with his instructions to the jockey. And he said to the jockey, right, for the first 2/3 of the race, just follow the pace. Don't just tuck in and follow the pace. And then in the last third of the race, just let the horse go for it. He said, nobody will pass you, but if they do, it'll be either me or the Duke of Norfolk. Okay, so not sure it was worth the wait, but...
Thank you very much, Jan. Just a few seconds for questions, maybe. So check your data and check your methods also. This is what I learned, and this is certainly a great lesson for scholars and others. Any questions? No. Oh, yes.
Thanks. So it was extremely interesting. And I was just wondering, in the study you do on the workplace challenge, actually, so you say that they took on and they did more exercise. But then what would be the displacement effect there, or the substitution effect?
Yeah,
because they didn't...
Yeah, we measured displacement. Well, we measured substitution directly. We also measured displacement within the companies, and it's true that some of the companies actually had their own exercise schemes going, which they abandoned for the period of the workplace challenge because they thought the workplace challenge was better. So we identified that as part of the calculation, if you like, for the impact on the group as a whole. What we couldn't do, though, is discover whether there was displacement outside of work. So it may have been, for example, that there were out-of-work teams of cyclists who cycle to work and back together who no longer do that because they're involved in the workplace challenge and so on. But we did measure the level of activity before the program, as you saw, and the level of activity after the program. So the net gain in terms of substitution would be incorporated there, but the loss in terms of displacement would not be recorded there, but we do record it in the article. It's hard to put a number on it, but you need to take it into account. Yeah. Keith.
No, it's okay, I can speak now. Is there any data specifically on East London? Because that's where it came to.
Yeah. There will have been local schemes undertaken within the local authorities, as you know, and you probably know better than I do which ones. And some of the Sportivate data, I think, there were schemes introducing young people in East London to clubs through this 8 to 10 coaching schemes and then taking them out to clubs and putting them in there, etc. The Sportivate data that we got was national. But we didn't ask for local data per se.
Follow-up study?
No, and it's a Sport England initiative, and I think it's no longer operating, is it, Sportivate? Or I think it might have morphed into another scheme. So, but some of the schemes were 2012 specific and stopped after the games, which seems an awful waste. The Gold Challenge was, for example. Yeah.
It'd be very interesting to follow it through, I think, in East London in particular, because of the nature of the people that live in East London.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that active people allows you to do is to identify local boosts in participation, but it doesn't allow you to allocate causality to a particular scheme. It just says that we know that in this period participation was raised for this particular area.
Thanks.
Is there any data on the impact of the Paralympics?
There's some data at a national level in terms of participation post the games, but it was a survey done by I forget, they've changed their name about 3 or 4 times now, but it's the Umbrella Association for Sport and Recreational Bodies. They did an audit after the games of Paralympic sports clubs in terms of their membership and whether or not memberships were boosted by that. So this is formal, not informal participation. And in fact, they found that the boost was relatively small. And it's partly, I think, because clubs didn't have the resources necessarily to take on extra athletes. In fact, this was true not just in Paralympic sport, but in other sports as well. When we talked to national governing bodies, some bodies had planned for this additional interest in sport after the games. So judo did, and they were rewarded by having a significant increase in memberships. Some said, well, we always thought the games would make more people interested, and they're coming and knocking at the door, but we don't have enough coaches, don't have enough time on the timetable. We're already full. So, of course, that never really realises itself, that demand. So, but the figures are disappointing for disability sport. I can give you the survey, by the way, if you want. I've got a copy of the survey.
Okay, one more, or yeah, I have one. So clearly, London 2012 were probably the most evaluated games ever. But do you know of any good study in other games, other cities? And what do you think of the OGI study, the Olympic Games Impact, which is commissioned by the IOC?
Well, the OGI, of course, deals largely with IOC-driven criteria. And the meta-evaluation study is pinned directly to the legacy claims which government gives. So they're not trying to do the same thing. I think, in a sense, that as with meta-evaluation, I think the OGI studies probably need to go through a couple of cycles at least, in order for us to be able to see whether this is simply a data collection exercise.
It was not used in London, as far as I know. It was used in Vancouver a lot, but not in London.
Well, it's I think in East London were responsible for.
Yeah, sure, university.
Yeah, yeah. They did they did the second report.
Yeah, but it wasn't accepted.
Was it? Because there is no third and fourth report, and that's yeah. Okay, so.
It's not me, by the way.
No. I wasn't. That wasn't a conspiratorial question. It was.
In Albertville also there was a report which was never published.
Oh,
But
right.
it's a long story.
Yeah.
Old story.
But I mean, one of the things I think the IOC was concerned to do was to make it a condition of being successful as a candidate city, and it just shows the difficulty of legally applying that. Once the contract's been signed, it's very difficult to hold the host city to.
So far, London is the benchmark for this evaluation, or meta-evaluations.
But as I say, it's different from the OGGI because it is a
right.
yeah. But it is.
What about
I think,
Rio, for example? Is there anything coming in Rio?
I don't know if they're going to follow the line. And one of the things which I think would be really valuable would be to move away a bit from looking at Rio or London or whatever, and to say, right, let's take not all of the studies from Rio out, but let's take all of the studies that use extrinsic motivators, and let's see what the context is within which extrinsic motivators work for getting people to participate more often and so on and so forth. So you could draw on studies from very different contexts and different countries, and there could be a fair amount of policy learning across boundaries, I think, with that kind of work.
Well, thank you very much. We have...